Hi, everybody. This is Derek from Both Sides of the Fence, and I'm probably pretty sure I can guess you're surprised that you're seeing me before the episode. Well, that's because we have a special treat, and a crazy one at that. Our next special guest is Anya Marino, which you're going to meet her in just a few seconds. However, you will only be meeting her in audio. Now, you're probably wondering, why? I want to see the video. Okay, I get it. I know. However, my beautiful team, along with myself and Jen, we're kind of using this next episode as kind of practice as we really started filming all of the episodes for all of you. The episode turned out so amazing for the audio and the experience that we could not post it. And because of who Anya Marino is and what she's going to be representing at the podcast, we knew it was only perfect to drop it during Pride Month. Now, because of that being said, you're not going to be able to see a video. You will see some beautiful photos and some great things from us and clips during the performance that you'll be able to see on YouTube, but it will just be streaming for audio. I can assure you it is an episode that you don't need the video because it's that amazing. You're going to learn, you're going to laugh, you're going to cry, and you're going to have a wonderful time. We're so excited. We were so honored to have Anya, not just a friend, an amazing advocate for our community, but what I call a sister to me. I love you all so much. Stay tuned. It's coming in just a few seconds. Enjoy. I love you all, and make sure to take care of one another out there. Bye, everybody. Until next time.
Welcome back to Both Sides of the Fence. We're super excited to have you back with us. Yes. And I am super excited about the guest that we have with us today. Today, our guest's name is Anya Marino. Am I getting that correct?
You did.
She is a singer, educator, legal advocate who currently holds the title of Miss Gay America Femme 2026. Mm-hmm. By day, Anya serves as the Chief Strategic Programs Officer for Advocates for Transgender Equality, helping lead national legal and policy efforts focused on transgender and non-binary rights. She also directs and teaches in the LGBTQI+ Equality Clinic at the University of Maryland School of Law, and previously taught in the LGBTQ+ Advocacy Clinic at Harvard Law School. Before that, she served as Deputy Legal Director for the ACLU of Florida, where she oversaw voting rights litigation and worked on LGBTQ+ and First Amendment cases. Anya is the first openly transgender woman of color to hold a senior legal role at the ACLU and the first to teach at Harvard Law School. Today, we're looking forward to a thoughtful conversation about law, policy, and some of the biggest cultural debates happening in the country right now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited about this.
Do you have time in your schedule?
Honestly.
Okay. Go ahead, Jen.
Anya, first question. You've spent much of your career advocating for transgender rights through law, policy, and education. Our show tries to bring people from very different perspectives together. So I'd like to start here. What do you think people on the conservative side of this debate most often misunderstand about transgender people and the work that you do?
That's a fantastic question. So I want to begin by actually identifying a few facts.
Sure.
And the reality is that GLAAD Media has actually identified that about 80% of the American population believe that they've had no interaction with a trans or non-binary individual. So all of the information that they receive about trans and non-binary people is typically from the media. And if we look at the way that media has historically portrayed trans and non-binary people, it is in a negative and pejorative sense. Among the most early examples actually is a silent film that was released where a gender variant individual who I would characterize as genderqueer, not necessarily as a trans woman. So we're talking
silent film era.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Where essentially that particular character was essentially the brunt of jokes. If you fast forward through time and you look at the way that unfortunately the Ed Gein story was told by Alfred Hitchcock in Psycho, there is a conflation between certain paraphilia and what it means to be a trans individual. And that has unfortunately carried over into modern times. And we've seen that in films like, of course, Silence of the Lambs, where Buffalo Bill was oftentimes mischaracterized as a trans individual. Yet we see Anthony Hopkins' character in the film actually say, well, Buffalo Bill was not actually a trans woman.
Yeah.
And then we see other examples of it in live television shows, talk shows, where oftentimes trans women are seen as, or rather characterized as predators or something to cause cis men who oftentimes express an attraction to trans women as something to cause them to retch. And so I think oftentimes there is a lot of misconception what it means to be a trans individual. And we're truthfully no different than anyone else. And all we're seeking on a daily basis to have our ability to have our humanity recognized, much like anyone else.
Absolutely. And, I have never made those, I've seen all of the movies that you've referenced. I've never made those kind of connections. But now that you pointed it out, I can absolutely see that was a representation of that. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And you know what? As far as me being a gay man, for me, I think I have to agree with you, Jen. I've watched every movie. I didn't identify the same, but for me, it wasn't necessarily because I couldn't connect with that experience. It was my environment that I grew up in. So I couldn't catch it the same way that you could because I wasn't taught to see those things at that moment. If we can, I'd like to pivot for a second and talk a little bit about some civil liberties and some mandates. One of my questions is, when should the line between protecting people from discrimination and protecting the First Amendment rights of people who disagree with the gender identity ideology, what would you say to that, and how could you educate people on the difference between the two?
Well, so a couple of things that I want to identify. Preliminarily, the First Amendment solely prohibits the government from infringing on any individual's speech, right? And when I say the government, I mean preliminarily the federal government, because that was how it was initially applied. And then through the 14th Amendment due process clause, it has been implicitly applied to the states. And so we've seen that actually through what's called the incorporation doctrine. And so every individual, as I said, has a right to express themselves and also has certain associational rights as well when it comes to associational expression. But of course, no right is absolute. And among the many ways that we see that play out, of course, is workplaces, right? We have something called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in the workplace. And among the many ways that you can demonstrate an employer's liability for engaging in discrimination is when they've subjected you to a hostile work environment. In essence, an untenable work environment, a place in which you're not able to be at all productive because of the harassment or disparate treatment that you've experienced there, right? Now, the court has basically outlined where we kind of draw the line between what is considered harassment and what is essentially considered an off-the-cuff remark that otherwise is perhaps inappropriate or inflammatory. But for it to qualify as harassment, it needs to be severe and pervasive. Now, it really depends on context, right? Because context matters in every scenario.
Yeah,
but it's
absolutely.
also interpretive, right?
Yeah.
Context.
It is indeed interpretive. And that's frequently why courts come in to address these issues. But certainly everyone should be able to work in a place of work where they feel valued, capable, and respected for their contributions there, and to also feel safe while working.
Sure.
And if there is an individual who is subjecting that employee to repeated and relentless harassment because they happen to be a trans individual or an otherwise LGBTQ identifying individual, or a Black person, or a person who happens to be Muslim, or a person who also happens to be of a different national origin, let's say, then Title VII comes in and says, no, you're prohibited from doing that, especially if the employer is on notice of that harassment happening in the workplace and then refuses or essentially ignores what's happening. That generates the employer's liability. So an employer does indeed have an obligation to create a workspace where everyone feels welcome and is able to contribute, right? When it comes to something like pronouns, I would say that everyone makes mistakes. Certainly, I even make mistakes about pronouns, okay? And that's oftentimes because we all make assumptions based on the presentation that we see before us.
Sure.
Natalie,
but when someone corrects, my misgendering, I often simply say, I'm so sorry, and we move on. I won't do it again. I don't necessarily see that as an infringement on my First Amendment right. Indeed, it's not an enforcement by the government on my ability to express how I'm expressing myself. To me, it's just a matter of respect. An individual has told me who they are. I'm going to respect who they are. Now, when it comes to the way that we've seen First Amendment freedoms actually being eroded in places like educational environments, I'm sad to say that oftentimes conservative policy has actually done a really terrible job of eroding First Amendment freedoms in educational environments by actually restricting true and accurate information in public school systems, where we've seen them essentially prohibit students of all ages from accessing books from everyone from forgive me now, I can't remember authors' names.
You're fine.
But long story short, essentially restricting authors who have generated stories, literature, biographies, reference books that cover everything from racial justice in this country to gender justice in this country. And then also any books that maintain characters that happen to be either persons of color and or individuals who happen to be LGBTQI plus identifying. But the First Amendment actually protects individuals' ability to access those documents because the First Amendment engenders what we call the marketplace of ideas. The framers intended for the marketplace of ideas, especially in places like schools and libraries, to allow people to develop their own independent thought and analysis. Yeah. And so unfortunately, what we see happening more often than not, unfortunately, in places like Florida, in places like Georgia, in places like Texas, is them eroding the ability of students, eroding the ability of other individuals to have true and accurate information.
So, Jen, real quick,
just
go ahead.
A couple of things.
Sure.
I think from the conservative perspective, there's a lot of fear from the conservative side of things, and one of the things that I have had repeated to me is why should I be forced to call somebody by their pronouns? There's this fear in that their right is being taken away by being forced to address someone in some way, shape, or form. I just want to mention this because from my perspective, I think that's absolutely ludicrous. There's no reason why you can't respect that person for their abilities.
Right.
It shouldn't really come into the conversation. So I completely agree with you on that front. But talking about the books that are restricted from schools, in your opinion, is there an age factor in that? And the reason I'm asking from a conservative perspective, a lot of times they're scared that young children are going to have access to books that pertain topics in them that maybe they feel are not age appropriate. Does that make sense?
It does. And the Supreme Court has actually outlined 2 areas in which books are evaluated in educational systems.
Really? Wow.
The first involves curriculum. The second involves libraries. So when it comes to libraries, what the court has essentially said is the material has to essentially be consistent with what would be available to an individual of that age, right? It's a little bit of a murky standard that's applied. And to be clear, I haven't litigated as many of these cases as other First Amendment freedom issues. But what I would say is there is an evaluation. What the court has essentially said you can't do, though, is indoctrinate people. You can't essentially identify what is orthodox for an entire community. Okay. You have to open up the ability for people to have access to different thoughts and ideas.
Sure,
right?
Absolutely.
And certainly that is something that we should all celebrate because having access to different thoughts and ideas actually leads to innovation. It leads to creativity. It leads to independent thought. I also understand, however, the concern that sometimes there might be materials that are inappropriate for an individual who's maybe 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, or otherwise in primary school, right? But the law already provides somewhat of a balance to prohibit children from accessing materials that are inconsistent with their age. What the law also, however, does is prohibit government from mandating what is orthodox or what is appropriate and what is inappropriate for an entire large swath of people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Can
and
you
I think
give
that
an
helps.
example, Anya, something a little bit like when you were breaking down the law,
Sure.
with that, can you give like a layman terms example for just the viewers too, maybe that may not be able to catch it on as a law standpoint, but it's just a daily experience?
Sure. So there's actually an LGBTQ plus author who has created a series of illustrated books for young children that shows two penguins in a same-sex relationship. And it shows them traveling together. It shows them essentially adopting a child together as one would any other family, right? But it's intended for younger children so that they have access to those materials should they want access to those materials, right? No one's essentially saying you need to read this. It's in essence just a matter of if you want it, it's there. And so what happens is because that is age appropriate for children who are in primary school, that book should otherwise be available to children in primary school. What would essentially be a violation of the law would be if, as an example, a public school district were to say, no, we are essentially eliminating all books that maintain any reference to same-sex couples or to gender identity or, in essence, to sexual orientation. They can't do that. What they can do, however, is identify what in essence would be consistent with the learning age of that child.
Okay.
And I think,
is that useful?
It is
yes,
useful.
Absolutely.
It is useful. I think that some of the fear from the conservative perspective or concern is that why does it have to be illustrated one way or the other specifically at all? Why do we have to make those? Why do we have to make those things evident to children at all, either being heterosexual or any other? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily expressly stated that it's a same-sex couple. You're just seeing them carry on much like any other couple would. The reality is most people, because of the way that, data has demonstrated, most people are heterosexual. Most people are also cisgender. But there are people who are gay. There are people who are bi. There are people who are trans. There are people who are non-binary. And so having exposure, just simply having an awareness of that those groups of people exist isn't a bad thing.
Sure.
Indeed, it makes people more well-rounded and helps them better navigate society outside of a
and maybe
school
take some
place.
of the fear away as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, agreed. With I have one more question about the book thing though. With as far as education, for me, as you know, I'm liberal in many, many aspects, but I sometimes wonder if a book in general, not just the penguins, and do you believe or feel that it should be something done more in the personal home where the child is safe, comfortable, understands and knows that the family around them, there's a trust level to that? Or do you think, is it more beneficial that way? Or do you feel that the child would be able to get the same benefit if it was displayed in the presence of, let's say, a classroom, a 6th grade classroom? Would that child be able to accept it and understand that if they had questions in terms of that? Or would it be easier, do you think, in the home?
Well, I think it's a mixture of both, right? There are certainly scenarios in which there are very adult themes that traverse all forms of literature that children are exposed to at different ages. For example, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne is studied by every sophomore here in the United States when they take American literature. And there are very adult themes in that story. There's adultery. There's, childbirth out of wedlock. There is the shunning and disregard of a woman for having essentially owned her own sexuality. Those are topics that are discussed at what age? 15 for most people who are sophomores in high school. So we're already discussing topics of human sexuality, specifically heterosexual orientation within the context of those classrooms at those ages. In essence, what we're simply doing is broadening the scope so that people have an opportunity to see all different forms of the people that exist here in the United States or across the world, right? And so I use Nathaniel Hawthorne as an example because it's perhaps one of the most explicit examples of what we see, right? Another would be Kate Chopin's The Awakening, right? That's typically also studied during one's sophomore year of high school. The Awakening also has a series of facts in it. They're not really facts, but a narration, if you will, where in essence, the character walks away from her family. She becomes her own woman, and she kind of expresses her sexuality quite overtly in ways that hadn't otherwise hadn't been seen. And it also involves examples of suicide in the story as well. So those are topics that have otherwise been covered in literature classes for a significant period of time. Everyone also studies To Kill a Mockingbird. We're dealing with rape there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're dealing with a really contentious trial there. We're dealing with racial justice issues in there as well. So why not provide everyone the opportunity to see all the beauty and complexity that is the public that exists here in America and our history as well.
So you mean not necessarily forcing, but definitely giving families and education the opportunity to be able to choose if it's something that they would like to research or educate themselves on. It should just always be available. Everything and all things should be available.
Well, certainly a public school identifies which curriculum they're going to teach, right? And there are certainly canon books that are discussed, whether we're talking about literature, whether we're talking about foreign language, whether we're talking about social sciences, whether we're talking about the hard sciences, right? Or even mathematics. But everything is otherwise, generally speaking, available in libraries. Now, when it comes to, as an example, a family's rejection of certain concepts that may otherwise be discussed in a school, well, there's been a clear solution to that that's existed in this country actually since we had integration. And that's in part because several white nationalists throughout the South decided to excise their children from public school systems and send their children to private schools because they didn't want their children going to school with black children. Now, I'm not suggesting that is an appropriate solution.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a lot of value in having a diverse student body. But if a parent doesn't like what a school is essentially embracing and offering to students to teach or learn, there's always the option to send your child to another school. In most cases, it is a private school or a parochial school.
Sure.
Or cyber. Of course, we have seen that grow a lot too.
And I think, as a mom, and this is where we can differ on opinions, I personally wanted to have those initial conversations with my children in regards to gender identity and sexuality myself. It was not that I wanted to make them biased in any way. I wanted to be the initiator of those conversations in my particular family.
I understand.
Yeah.
The reality is, though, most children begin developing their concept of sexual orientation and gender identity between 3 and 4. You may notice from your own interaction with your child probably asked a number of times in their infancy or as they were a toddler, is this a boy or a girl?
Yeah.
Who are they with? So these are concepts that they're already grappling with at an early age. Mm-hmm. And there is a simple answer to that, right? Let's say, hypothetically speaking, a 4-year-old were to meet Derek. And you happen to have a daughter who is 4 years old, right? She meets Derek and she asks you, oh, well, does Derek have a wife? And you could just simply say, no, actually, Derek has a husband. Mm-hmm. And that's the end of the conversation.
And I have no problem having that conversation, but I just prefer it was from...
Absolutely. Well, here's a prime example, if you guys don't mind, real quick. Everly, me and my husband had a quite comical scenario the first time our niece and nephew stayed the night. And we have 2 bedrooms upstairs. We have our main room and our spare bedroom. And she went to Boncel one day and she says, Uncle Boncel, where does Uncle Derek sleep? And Boncel says, well, right there. And Everly says, okay, well, where does Uncle Derek sleep? Or where do you sleep? And Boncel says, right here. She says, no. Where does Uncle Derek sleep? And he said, right here. She said, well, who sleeps in there? Well, nobody sleeps in there unless we have guests. And as he's chuckling, the point of the story, the take from this is her response was simply this. Okay.
Yeah.
And then walked away.
Yeah.
But then next time she came back, she had other simple questions. And then
she went away and thought about it quite clearly.
And then the third time she goes to Nana and she says, Nana, are Uncle Derek and Uncle Boncel like mommy and daddy? Because Uncle Boncel said they sleep in the same bed and you and Pappy sleep in the same bed and you and Daddy sleep in the same bed. So they have to be together if they sleep in the same bed, right? And my mom said yes. And then she said, ask your mom And that's what I love too. As a grandparent, my mom gave the opportunity for my sister to have that dialect with her daughter. And so she went home and she said, yes. And she said, and there's this picture on their wall of, I think it's me as a baby, and they're both dressed up. Did they get married? And mom and my sister said, yes, honey, they got married. And she said, okay. And then she went back. Yeah. It's incredible, like you were saying, that allowing a child to have that opportunity, no matter how young they are, it's a self-taught method. And now when she comes over, the questions have stopped for her. Because there's been an acceptance and understanding. And she also recognizes that there's no harm or negativity to who her uncles are. All she recognizes that we love her. So again, I like, that's why I said I see both sides as far as the education, but also like Jen said, it sometimes can be faster, and the confusion I think can be a little less when it comes from somebody that there's so much trust, and admiration too.
Well, but there may be also scenarios where a child is in a school, right, in a classroom, and one of their classmates is expressing themselves authentically. Yeah. I mean, anecdotally, I was one of those children, right, where I began expressing my gender authentically at age 2, 3, 4, or 5. There was no mystery that I was a woman or a girl at that early age. And indeed, most of my classmates assumed that I was a girl until I had an educator in kindergarten who expressed horror at seeing me just act in a way that was natural for me. Yeah. And then following that, unfortunately, that news about the way that I was expressing myself was disseminated across the school. It made its way to all parents. And then I was sadly isolated from all of my classmates. You see, I grew up amid the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, where there was an enormous amount of misinformation around HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. And around that time, there was a perception, because people didn't understand how the disease was contracted, that if you were even around someone who was perceived as LGBTQI+, that you would likely end up contracting HIV. We all know that's not true, right? We also know that there was no harm in me sharing a classroom with these children. But the reality is, because of the perceptions at that time and the fear that existed and the absence of information, it meant that I spent most of my childhood completely isolated from my classmates. It also meant that I didn't go to a school where I felt safe and supported, because I was tormented relentlessly, not only verbally, but also physically. And it also meant, unfortunately, that the school was directing my parents to send me to conversion practices, which I suffered from age 4 until the age of 14. And I don't want any child to have to go through that.
I don't want to, Jen, did you have something?
No,
right
go
there?
ahead.
Real quick, because I know Jen has another question for you. You mentioned conversion camp, and to those, and I want to bring this up because we're starting to see an uptick and the potential of those starting to reappear again. I think when you hear conversion camp, there's many things that, that you can go from. I mean, there's history and past experiences across the world where we've taken that word to a situation. Specifically for LGBT, as me and there was extreme and harsh conditions for these individuals, such as bringing in grown women to force sex upon a 13-year-old boy who's identifying as a gay male.
That's sexual violence.
Or a boy being laid down on a table while 8 adult male counselors rape him. So the identity of the intimacy is, it was supposed to be a counseling concept and it was actually started through churches who started creating a narrative. There's actually a documentary about a leading church that started creating that narrative. Can you explain on a standpoint for viewers that don't know and maybe should educate themselves on the catalyst of what a conversion camp is specifically designed for and what it was designed for the LGBT community?
Wow. So that is a loaded question.
And as brief as you can, obviously, because I know it's a lot, but really, if you could take a couple paragraphs to really tell the viewers the extent of the danger of something like that.
So here's what I'll say. Conversion practices really run the gamut. You can see everything from the violence that you've described, which is physical in nature, to talk therapy, which is also a form of violence when you think about it, because in essence, what happens during those sessions is you learn shame. You learn to hate yourself. You learn to hide who you are, to essentially navigate society in a way that society deems appropriate for you
and given your sex assigned at birth, right? Whether we're talking about sexual orientation or gender identity. And so oftentimes what happens is it has an extreme and deleterious effect on the patient. And it's actually been proven by every major medical organization here in the United States to be a false science. It's completely ineffective. And essentially what it does more so than anything else is cause harm. And yet we see a number of providers still engage in the practice, notwithstanding the fact that it is ineffective and that it does cause harm. Now, what we see oftentimes these providers say is, well, I have a First Amendment right to speak. You do, but you're also engaging in a practice.
Mm-hmm.
You're providing treatment.
At that point, it's past the line.
You're not just talking.
Yeah.
You're caring for someone.
Yeah.
And if you're not providing appropriate care, then in essence, you're either engaging in malpractice or you're actually abusing an individual, either emotionally or physically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that should never happen.
For something that inherently, for most, it's something that cannot be changed in that individual when it comes to that. So you're only creating extensive trauma on top of whatever experience.
I mean, we saw how well it worked out for me, right?
I mean, based on this, honey, it worked out pretty well in your case, I feel.
No.
But what my point in that is everyone's path and journey is different. Yeah. Me and you agree that we were two blessed people. Jen knows a lot of my story too. It definitely, I take credit for the strength that I had to get through that. But unfortunately, everybody's situation is different. Not everybody gets through those moments. We know statistically when conversion camps came out, it would be shocked for people to know that 83% of all people that went into those camps within 5 years of them leaving committed suicide.
Yeah.
And it was because of all that physical and trauma pain that it just took them a longer time to let it defeat them.
Are they otherwise incapable of forming strong emotional bonds with other individuals due to mistrust that they developed as a consequence of the trauma that they experienced while being subject to conversion practices?
Thank you for just breaking that down.
I can't imagine as a mom, whether I understood what my child was going through or not, putting them through something like that. Like, I just can't, whether I believed or didn't believe in their journey, I can't imagine putting my child through that. Like, I can't.
And to be clear, like, I don't blame my parents at all for what happened to me as a child. My parents love me. I love them. They believed they were providing me what was actually seen as the standard of care at that time.
Sure.
And it turns out, as we know, to be harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So true.
But, I mean, that just illustrates, however, that it's important to be as informed as one can.
Sure.
When thinking about the type of care that you want to provide a child.
Absolutely.
Well, sorry, one more thing, Jen, if you don't mind. And Jen, me and you just recently talked about this about my past, and I told you about the medical team. Back then, like you said, now we have social media, we have all these contents, and back then you didn't have that. So therefore, what was the first thing you went to?
Your doctor.
If your psychologist, your doctors, your guidance counselors stated, well, your son, for example, I was sexually molested as a child. And so one of the things back then was it was automatically pretty much stapled on you that if you were sexually assaulted, you will sexually assault another individual. And I was in and out of several placements. I spent most of my adolescence and teen life in shelters because my parents, again, as angry as I was at them at the time, as much pain as it caused me, now that I've grown older, like you said, I've learned to understand that they were under the guidance of what they believed to be professionals. And so there had to be a little form of empathy and forgiveness I felt from my parents because they were so lost. Like you explained with Nayeli, you were so lost in moments that sometimes it's hard for a proper guide. And when you don't have a guide, you rush to the thing that you believe has the professional and educated experience to guide you.
And first, let me say, I'm sorry that happened to you. It really saddens me to hear that. Second, what I would say is
my family is amazing now. They've come around. But yes,
whenever you were talking to any professional, right? It's always good to understand that professional is not only a professional in their practice, but is also a human themselves, which means that they're coming into the work with their own biases.
Sure.
Right.
And their own opinions.
And their own opinions about the way things should be. So oftentimes it's good to seek multiple opinions before making a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
That whole conversation does kind of lead into where we're going with this next, not on a good front, because I do consider myself a Christian. We attend church. But as someone who has worked on some of these First Amendment cases, how do you view conflicts between religious liberty and LGBTQ plus rights? Which should prevail when the two of them collide? Or is it a case-by-case basis?
I mean, I don't really think that there needs to be any conflict between being LGBTQI plus and Christian. If we look at Christ's teachings as an example, at no point in any of Christ's teachings does he talk about LGBTQI plus people or hating anyone or otherwise judging an individual. If we look at his Beatitudes as an example, he talks about all of these people who have either been subject to oppression or othering. And he says all of those people are blessed, right? Mm-hmm. At no point does he actually say to anyone, we should cast them aside. Indeed, the only example that I can think of where he actually says, where he shuns people or where he waves his finger at anyone is when he's at the Temple of Jerusalem, right? When he throws over the tables and you see the coins going everywhere, and he talks about the Philistines and how they know better than everyone else. And he says, no, you don't. We're not here to judge other people. We're here to embrace everyone, right? And so I think that's really what Christ's message is embracing everyone, providing them the love that they deserve, recognizing their humanity. And so I don't see any conflict between being a Christian and being LGBTQI plus. Now, to be clear, just because I've studied scripture doesn't necessarily mean I identify as a Christian.
Sure, absolutely.
But I do understand that there is a lot of value in Christ's teachings. I think oftentimes what we unfortunately see, though, is that there are some sects within Christianity that use rigid gender roles, rigid understandings of what it means to be a man or a woman, mm-hmm. Rigid understandings of what human sexuality means to impose control over others. And that sadly benefits no one. And who it's harmed the most historically is actually women. Yeah. And so what I would say is
women in general.
Women more broadly.
Yeah.
Right. And so what and in addition to it having historically harmed women, it's also historically harmed people of color, right? And we've seen that actually the way that a very specific form of Christianity was proliferated across the globe during colonialism and imperialism, where oftentimes, as an example here in the Americas, when Western settlers came over, Western Europeans, of course, were white, they were Christian, they had very rigid standards of what sex and gender meant, what human sexuality meant, and they encountered indigenous people who were, of course, of a different race, who had different gender expression, who recognized two-spirit people, who recognized culture. Women, of course, in places of power as well. And they were seen as primitive instead of just simply respecting individuals for who they were. So oftentimes, right, or pagan, right. Mm-hmm. But the reality is even Christianity itself has embraced many pagan traditions if we look at the way that it's developed. But I guess my point is, I think we need to actually look at the actual cause for one's assertion of a faith. Is it really about an expression of one's faith and one's sincerely held religious belief? Or it is essentially being used as a justification to another individual? That part. And I'm not sure. But what I would say is certainly one sincerely held religious belief doesn't necessarily mean that you're permitted to do whatever one wants, right? Like you can't sacrifice human beings as an example, right? Like you can't say, well, I'm a Mayan who's living in modern day, Carnegie, Pennsylvania, and I want to go ahead and do human sacrifice. That would be prohibited by law, right? And there are many reasons why that would be prohibited by law, right? And the same applies when it comes to discrimination in my mind, right? Because what we're talking about is an injury to another individual. Mm-hmm. And there is no harm in just simply identifying someone and respecting them for who they are.
When I tell Nayeli that all the time, I say to her, we may not understand things, but it's not our place to judge.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what our God teaches us.
And the past, and
we can still love them.
And to go off what you just said, we spoke on the last episode about labeling. Mm-hmm. And I just feel that I think we can all agree at this table, it's sad when any religion, because one thing that most religions have in common is there's a form of peace and love to the acknowledgement of their religion. And when it's weaponized, it's unfortunate because people are taking something that's supposed to be so beautiful and so uplifting and using it to harm one another when it's the very contradiction of what it's supposed to be for, right? And I just believe that in a conversation when you have at the table that I just lost my train of thought, honey. I know, totally, right? It happens from time to time, viewers, okay?
I'm excited about the next.
I know.
Well, let me try to bring this back home for you, if I may.
Please.
When we're talking about anyone's individual rights, right? And of course, certain government interests, it's about balance. That's really what it's about, right? The government's compelling interest or substantial interest in ensuring that all people are cared for and that all people are respected.
Thank you for answering
or
my
that
question.
no one is subject to discrimination, right? And another individual's assertion that their sincerely held religious beliefs or the First Amendment freedom to speech enables them to either harass an individual or otherwise deny them access to public goods and services or the like. And what the court has essentially said is, if there is a general rule if there is a neutral rule of general applicability that otherwise doesn't identify faith or isn't applied in a way that singles out or targets persons of faith, but does prohibit discriminatory practices, then that's fine. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Absolutely.
And it came back to me. My point in that was, okay, I know, it came back. It's all coming back to me now. Thank you, Cynthia. In the matter of, like I said, with as far as the labeling, I just feel that as a Christian, and I want to say this to everybody out there because I personally have dealt with not being able to control who I am and being shunned for something that was at one time and I'm working on now. I had great, strong faith and a very strong relationship with God. And it wasn't God that broke that. It was my peers that broke that for me. And I want to say to people, if you truly want to walk in Christianity specifically, because that's what my personal belief is, then it's quite simple. I mean, what, like you said earlier, they're specific or not in the Bible. At the end of the day, the ultimate statement from God and Jesus is very straight down the line. And it's to love your brother and your sister and to be accepting and help each other, one another when needed. And I just want people to remember it's such a simple, out of the entire Bible, it's that it always goes back to that same standard of love and acceptance. And that comes with, doesn't matter what you look like, the color of your skin, your gender, we're human. And God has created, we wouldn't be here if God didn't. Well, people believe different things, but for me, I wouldn't be here if God didn't create me for exactly who I am to be sitting at this table. So I just want people to remember when they're using that faith in front of them to make guidelines, remember what responsibilities that comes with, because it's about love and acceptance and admiration for your brother and your sister next to you.
Absolutely.
Jen, you take it away. I know we have a next really
We
good
are moving on,
question.
and I'm going to preface this with this is something that is very important to me, and I do have very relatively strong views on it.
Okay.
But when we talk about, and it is slightly contentious, transgender participation in women's sports. My daughter plays rugby. She's 125 pounds soaking wet. She's very good at the sport, but when this kind of became an issue, it terrified me because I instantly thought that if they opened the door for other individuals to participate in women's rugby with my daughter, she wears no padding, she wears no helmet, and they outweigh her by strength and weight substantially, she could become incredibly injured. The idea of my daughter playing rugby against someone who is biologically male with the muscle mass that entails and everything else absolutely terrifies me. What is your kind of view on this subject and why?
So I'm going to kind of zoom out for a minute, if I may. You referenced biological sex a moment earlier. The medical community and the scientific community don't actually acknowledge biological sex as a term.
Okay.
It's actually something that is legislatively constructed by politicians. It doesn't exist in science or medicine. When we talk about sex, actually, physicians and scientists measure sex over a variety of different factors. Only one of them, of course, is sex assigned at birth, which essentially means whatever an OBGYN perceives at the time of a baby's birth and whatever primary sex characteristics they observe at that time, right? But there are other ways to measure sex. Among them, of course, is chromosomal sex, gonadal sex, hormonal sex, pubertal sex, and of course, gender identity, right? And all of those things, for most people, align, but they don't for everybody. And for those who don't, they may either be intersex or they might be trans. And let me be clear, people who are intersex can either be trans or cis. There are a lot of cis people who actually don't know that they're intersex. And that's because there is a lot of gender variation.
Can you explain what that is too? Because there's a lot of our viewers who aren't going to know what intersex is.
Sure. So an intersex individual essentially is someone who maintains sex characteristics and traits that are discordant. So they may be either born with ambiguous primary sex characteristics, which is one way that one can be diagnosed, identified as an intersex. I don't want to say diagnosed because I don't want to pathologize intersex people. Other ways, of course, involve the way in which one develops. So if someone has chromosomes that are inconsistent with one's sex assigned at birth, that may indeed also be an indicator that that individual is intersex. If their hormonal sex is inconsistent with their sex assigned at birth, that may also be a way that that individual is intersex. And so it comes down to the discordance, right? When we talk about trans people, it is a very specific type of discordance that exists. It's the discordance that exists between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity, one's core conception of who they are. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Right. So again, you can have people who are trans and intersex. You can have people who are cis and intersex. You can also have cis people who aren't intersex. You can also have trans people who aren't intersex. Okay. But the reality is sex as a whole is significantly more complex than what we all learn in what either freshman or sophomore year biology when we're in high school, right? It's significantly more complex than that. And indeed, we see the way that gender and sex are even varied across different species outside of humans as well, right? Where, like, as an example, there are some animals, if there are no females around, some animals can actually change sex to be able to continue reproduction, right? There are some, now we're not talking about an animal, but we are talking about a plant. Plants actually maintain sex organs from both sexes. So the reality is this type of variation among sex exists throughout all of life. It's not something that's unique to just people. We see it everywhere. When we're talking about providing access and opportunity to athletic programs, first, I think we need to ground this in in the fact that oftentimes we're talking about scholastic athletic programs, right? Athletic programs that exist in schools. And so we're talking about essentially educational opportunities and programs. And there's much more to sports than just winning and losing, right? Sports can teach us a lot of wonderful principles.
Absolutely.
It can teach us how to be leaders. It can teach us how to think critically. It can teach us how to strategize. It can teach us how to be a part of a team. It can also help us identify role models. And sports, am I falling out of this chair?
No, you're not falling out of this chair, girl.
And sports also, you got it?
The back was coming up.
Sorry.
Gotcha.
And
You're
sports also, students who also participate in sports have also been shown to have better academic outcomes than students who haven't. Sports
across the
also,
board.
Correct, across the board. And sports also are a way to engender inclusion, right? And so when you exclude any student from participating in those educational programs or activities, they're being deprived of the same learning opportunities, the same ability to engage with their peers that many otherwise take for granted. I understand your concerns about safety. I totally do. But I think that there's also a misconception about what most trans people are like. If we're talking about a teen who happens to be trans, to even be able to access athletic programs consistent with their affirmed gender,
that affirmed gender has to be insistent, consistent, and persistent, right? They can't just wake up one morning and say,
Sure.
oh, guess what? I'm a boy today. I'm going to go play on the boys' team, or vice versa. Guess what? I'm a girl today. I'm going to go play on the girls' team. And one of the reasons why the medical community requires consistency, persistency, and insistency is because it's really hard for a kid to keep up a lie for a really long time.
Sure.
Right? And oftentimes, youths who are able to come out as trans in their earlier years or in their formative years have had access to gender affirming care much earlier than an individual like myself who didn't have access until she was in her 30s, in part because accessibility was non-existent. And so what that means oftentimes is, even assuming there is this notion of performance advantage, which, to be clear, no medical study has demonstrated, and we can talk about that in a minute. A child who has undergone, for example, puberty blockers, or has otherwise had access to cross-sex hormone therapy, would not otherwise develop consistent with their sex assigned at birth. They would develop consistent with their affirmed sex. And so were there even any assumption that performance advantage existed that would otherwise mitigate that concern, right? So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing that I would say is, as I noted, the medical literature and the scientific literature doesn't actually demonstrate that any performance advantage exists. Oftentimes when we hear people talk about performance advantage or that boys are better at athletics, that's actually an arcane stereotype that has existed throughout Western culture. There's a belief that boys are better at everything. Now, if you were to ask me, I think girls are better at everything.
I was just going to say, I think it's disheartening because it really does that part really takes away from women and sports.
I wouldn't say that boys are better at rugby than girls at all.
Yeah.
That isn't, what I
as a
saying.
generalization.
And now listening to you, I think that I would change my view and say it would have to be done then on a case-by-case basis. Yeah. Because if it were an individual that hadn't gone through therapies that would change the actual aspect of their physical development, then I probably would still unfortunately have an issue just because I'm worried about my daughter's safety.
So I can hear that. And so there are, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
There are other ways that we can address that, right? I do want to talk about performance advantage for a second, because the studies that do exist that try to assert that boys are more athletically inclined than girls are actually biased. They're not strike that. The studies that are actually asserting that trans girls are more athletically inclined than cis girls are biased because they're not actually engaging in a study of trans girl to cis girl. What they're actually doing is engaging in a study of cis girl to cis boy. And that's in part because the trans population is so exponentially smaller than the cis population that engaging in that type of study is virtually impossible.
Can you elaborate that? So give them two numbers, the number of our trans community in general, and then in sports, because we're already 1%, less than 1%.
Yeah,
now youth, then from that to in sports, how many?
I mean, trans youth comprise less than 1% of the general population, right? And when we're talking about trans youth who otherwise are athletically inclined, that's an even significantly lower number. And that's in part because no child wants to potentially subject themselves to mistreatment. And oftentimes a trans youth is already being relentlessly tormented in school anyway. The last thing that they want to do is participate in an athletic program. So for those who do want to participate, I certainly want to make sure that they're able to participate so that they feel included, right? And have access to the same opportunities that any other student would. But again, those studies that have existed are indeed biased. Let's talk about safety for a minute, because I know that is a concern of yours. There are other ways to address safety that don't necessarily mean excluding a large swath of people who are trans. You can train athletes, you can train students, you can train coaches to teach people how to engage in athletic programs in a safer manner that doesn't lead to injury as much as presently may exist, right? So it's more about education and training and less about exclusion. The other thing I would say about sports, and this is something that I think a lot of people don't think about, is that when you have policies that exclude trans women and girls from sports, they have to be enforced somehow, right?
Well, what does enforcement look like? Enforcement oftentimes means engaging in some type of sex verification testing, which means any girl, whether she's cis or trans, who has her gender questioned may be subject either to a physical examination, may otherwise have to sign an affidavit indicating the last time she menstruated, may otherwise have to turn over her medical records to demonstrate that she was assigned female at birth, and may otherwise be subject to sexual violence upon having to go through some type of physical examination by a third party, right? So we're dealing with potentially increasing the risk of violence against all women and girls. We're also dealing with extremely intrusive and humiliating practices that have been used to exclude, indeed, even intersex cis women from participating in athletic programs. And the way that this has essentially been enforced has actually led to severe casualties. Let me provide you 2 examples. So about 2 years ago, there were 2 athletes in Utah, both cisgender girls, both who excelled in sports. Yet one member of the state school board questioned their gender. And because she questioned those 2 girls' genders, both those students and their parents and the rest of their families had to be under law enforcement protection. No child have to go through that trauma.
Sure.
No child should have to be excluded like that.
And again, they weren't even identifying as trans.
They weren't trans. They were cis girls. But the reason that this school board official questioned their gender is because they happened to have buzz cuts, they were wearing baggy clothing, and they had athletic builds because they're athletes.
Sure.
Right? And we've also seen the way that this has been disparately enforced against women of color. There are several examples of how this has actually been disparately enforced against women of color in elite athletics. Here are 2 examples actually of Olympians, Caster Semenya and Duthy Chand, both exceptional runners, both prohibited from participating in athletic programs, despite that neither of them were trans, but happened to be intersex individuals who are cis. And then we also look at the way that Serena Williams has had her gender questioned repeatedly, time and time again, up until the time that she retired.
Sure.
Because she has an athletic build and she was the greatest tennis player of all time, right?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the exclusion of any woman, whether she's cis or trans, I think we need to think about what we're encouraging people to do. We're encouraging people to engage in body policing. We're encouraging people to engage in vigilantism. And we're actually increasing the risk of violence against all women and girls.
Yeah.
See, for me, I grew up in sports my whole life, even though I wasn't a fan of all sports. But, and see, for me, I'm kind of in the middle. Me and you've had this conversation before. The problem is for me is I believe in everybody having that opportunity to have a place to do what they love to do. Right.
And I agree with that. It's just hard to figure out how.
Yeah. And that's where it's hard for me because I am a little bit more conservative on the aspect of, I do think of somebody like my niece and the manner of that. And then seeing somebody like my dad's design and build that is in a transition and you see that in younger ages where boys are bulked up. You say Serena Williams against my little niece, she's not going to be very big. It could be terrifying if the sport was different. But unfortunately, we're also talking about such a small group of people that I think where the question mark is how do you move forward creating a space? Because you can't create their own space for that because there's not enough. So they wouldn't have fair opportunities.
Well, also, but
so how do you find,
an equal?
Yeah.
But when you're trying to meet in the middle at the table, I think that's where we keep being divided in this because the best scenario is for us to find a middle ground. And how do you think, based on just your experience on learning this, how do you think we could start moving forward to come to the middle to create a solution that everybody can be seen and everybody can feel safe?
So I'll say a couple of things to that. The first is a one-size-fits-all method doesn't work.
And that's what I'm taking from this conversation.
And there are many reasons for that. The first is different sports evaluate and measure different things, right? Some sports measure strength, some sports measure endurance, some sports measure agility, some sports measure hand-eye coordination,
Some sports measure speed. And so how do we have a one-size-fits-all method when sports measure different things and, of course, award individuals at having very specific skills in that sport? You mentioned, as an example, a rugby player, right? Let's say, hypothetically speaking, there is a trans girl who happens to be a taller stature. That may actually be a disadvantage in rugby. I don't know.
Sure.
But it may be.
I see what you're saying,
right?
That sometimes strengths in one thing could be a weakness in another.
Simultaneously, if I were trying to do gymnastics, I'm 5'9". I'm not like bulky, but I'm not petite enough to be a gymnast. I would have a significant disadvantage trying to be a gymnast because I'm not built like a gymnast,
sure.
right? Much like I would probably be a really bad figure skater because I don't have that agility either. The point is, again, they do measure different things. And I don't want to provide one anecdote, if I may. So I was a long distance runner before and after I was able to medically transition. Before my medical transition, I was consistently running half marathons at a sub-9 speed. That's a really good speed. It's not an elite speed, but it's a good speed,
mm-hmm.
right? And then I underwent my gender journey. And whenever I trained with my marathon group, I was consistently at the back of the pack. And the reason is I lost all of my muscle mass.
Mm.
I may still have the same frame I did previously, but I don't have the muscle that I need to lift that frame that I did previously. So I'm actually at a significant physical disadvantage whenever I try to run now.
Okay.
I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And so I've actually had to abandon running.
And that's, would you say, a big cause of the transitioning with what you were doing? Can you just explain a little bit of why that happens that way?
Sure. So the reason why I no longer have the muscle mass that I previously did is because I had hormone therapy. I essentially took one medication to eliminate the way that testosterone impacts my body. And I also take cross-sex hormones that enable me to have estrogen levels that are consistent with that of a cisgender woman. And because of that, I just simply don't have the strength that a cis man or I should say a person who is assigned male at birth who identifies as a man would have. I'm pretty sure that most people at this point could kick my ass. And that's also because, embarrassingly, I struggle to even open up that lip gloss over there. I couldn't.
You sure do, honey.
And that's because
you get
I just don't.
Your dresses.
Yeah, I do. I don't have strength anymore.
So just real quick, because we have so much other amazing
Sure.
stuff to ask you, but I have just two quick things. On the flip
Sure.
side, would you say the opposite happens with female transitioning to male? Does
With
it?
trans
Do they
boy or
gain
male?
Do they gain strength? Do you see the opposite result as they're transitioning? Because of course we see
testosterone.
the testosterone. Do you see that, or is that not necessarily a factor?
So a couple of things. There's really no clear indication how much of performance advantage testosterone otherwise provides. There is a lot of speculation that it does, but we're not entirely sure.
Okay.
But when I think of one example that unfortunately has led to that individual's isolation, I think of Mac Beggs, who was a trans boy who participated in wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling, in Texas when he lived there in high school. He began his gender journey as a high school student, but Texas had a policy that mandated that he engage in Greco-Roman wrestling with other individuals who maintained the same sex assigned at birth as he did. So he was wrestling against girls instead of wrestling against boys. To be clear, he didn't want to wrestle against girls. And oftentimes when he would show up to matches, all the cis girls who were assigned to wrestle with him didn't want to wrestle with him. They forfeited their matches because they thought it was an unfair advantage,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's also not a solution, right? Mandating that individuals who are trans be asked to participate in athletic programs consistent with their sex assigned at birth, because oftentimes that does actually create an unfair advantage.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, I don't necessarily agree with that either. Right now, you have schools with very small programs, and they do incorporate wrestling
Mm-hmm.
where girls are wrestling against boys. I don't agree with that necessarily either. So it's not that my beliefs are
You're
excluding
talking
one type
as
of individual.
a cis girl.
Correct.
With
Yeah,
it, yes.
I don't agree with that either.
And that's always been a back and forth in that field in that way.
So let's talk about Title IX, since we're talking about athletic programs real quickly, especially in educational environments. Title IX itself mandates that no person should be subject to discrimination on the basis of sex in educational programs and activities that receive federal funding. That's the law, right? Now, there are corresponding regulations that in essence permit sex separation. They don't mandate it, they permit it in certain scenarios, particularly when we're dealing with contact sports. And again, it's a permissive standard. It's not a mandatory standard. So some schools permit, unisex sport programs and intramural programs that certainly make sense, right? Yeah. And some schools don't. But if even you look at the two sports cases that are before the Supreme Court this term, right? We look specifically at BPJ Becky, who lives in West Virginia. She is not a star athlete. She could not make the varsity team if she tried. All she wanted to do was participate on her intramural running team. She was prohibited from doing so because West Virginia said, no, you have to participate on the boys' team. And all she wanted to do was feel included.
Yeah.
Again, it's not the necessarily wise at this point. I think most people are well-rounded. It's finding that the safe space for all. Yeah. Real quick, and if you could try and give a shorter answer.
I'm
so sorry. No, not in a bad way. I mean, me,
yeah.
because I keep asking these rebuttal questions. And I want to say this because me and Jen actually didn't write this down, but I feel that it's definitely something that needs to be discussed quickly. We've been talking a lot about on the court. But as you know, with legislation, it's been back and forth with the last couple administrations when we're talking about the safety and the issues in the bathrooms in and out of the sports. I've had in the salon, as you know, we see many walks of life that come through. And I have parents that, although love and completely have embraced just about every form of identity, they say, how do you handle an individual that identifies as an adult female, but then walks in the female restroom as a coach with a beard, no facial hair, dressed in boy clothes. And then your daughter comes home or your son comes home and says, I'm just confused, Mom, I don't understand. And then that parent calls, files a complaint, and then it's turned around that they are being discriminating against that coach or that teacher. How do you, in your educated advice, help people to understand, what is that discrimination or not discrimination, or is it more of a concern? And then B, how do you create a safe space for everybody so everybody can feel safe? Because I do believe that parents should have a right to make sure that their children are comfortable in that experience.
Sure. So a couple of things. I haven't ever heard a scenario like the one that you described involving a coach or a teacher. But
because it happened here locally. Apparently it did recently.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that most policies, if we're talking about locker rooms, and I'll talk about locker rooms first, and then we'll talk about bathrooms afterwards. Most policies regarding sex-separated spaces actually permit an individual who is of a different gender to enter that space for an enumerated set of circumstances. So, for example, let's say you have an elderly mother and she can't go to the bathroom alone. Okay. Most states that have these bathroom bans permit you to go into the bathroom with her to assist her. Did you know that?
No, so it's kind of a contradiction.
It is kind of a contradiction.
Male, I can go in with my grandmother to help her go to the bathroom where there's other girls.
I personally see that as different.
You
may disagree, but I do see that as different.
Do you believe?
Can I ask why?
I was just gonna say, Jen, why do you feel?
You're not going in there by yourself. There's a reason why you're going in there. I mean, if someone were going in there as a male to clean the locker room, or someone were going in there to assist somebody or assist their child, it's just as different to me. It feels
the reason
different.
that I would go to the women's restroom is to use the facilities. I'm just going to the bathroom. That's the only reason I'm going there. I also have an intent when I'm in there, and it's to relieve myself.
Yes, absolutely.
But I do believe.
And here's another thing. It doesn't bother me at all. But if I have a child who's 10 years old or 12 years old, it does lead me to kind of question who's going to be in the bathroom or the locker room with them. I mean, that's
so the question, Mark, is do we have to learn as a community to just accept that? Or is it okay to say, can we create a middle space and make sure that every state allows the safety of that individual to have a safe place to have that break, that space, that shower? You know what I mean?
So a couple of things that I would say. The first is, I am almost certain that you have used a public restroom with a trans woman. You may not have known
I have
it.
no problem with that.
Right. I am almost certain that most people have used a public restroom with a trans person and have complete ignorance to the reality that they have. And that's oftentimes because when we go to the restroom, we are very attuned of how much our safety is at risk. Every time I go to the bathroom, I am deeply concerned that I'm going to be accosted. I don't enter a restroom.
See, and I don't want that for you.
No,
either,
of course.
you know.
And that's what I'm saying. Again, that space
so
that needs to be made.
I go into the restroom. I use the facilities, I wash my hands, and I get out. And that's true of most people, right? Nobody really wants to hang out in the restroom unless you're a whole bunch of high school girls doing their makeup or whatever they do in the restroom these days. Yeah. I don't know. I'm just thinking about, did you grow up when My So-Called Life was on television? Yes. Okay, so you know the reference that I'm making right now. Okay. So the point is, most people just simply go to the restroom to use the restroom and then are out, right? But think about this. If we mandate that people go to the bathroom assigned to them, or rather consistent with their sex assigned at birth, what that means is trans women are going to the men's restroom and trans men are going to the women's restroom. Now, most trans men, much like most trans women, look like they're affirmed sex.
Sure.
Which is true.
So imagine you're going to have a whole bunch of men who are now going to the women's restroom. And you're not going to know one way or the other if that man who's entering that restroom is a trans man or a cis man with nefarious interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's significantly safer for you to go to a bathroom with a trans woman than it is with potentially a group of men, right?
Sure.
And so that's what I would say to that is like, oftentimes when you're talking about mandating these policies that would bar me from accessing a bathroom consistent with my affirmed gender, what you're also doing is mandating that men have access to women's restrooms.
Yeah.
And there's no way to otherwise police
when you
that.
look at it that way, it's yeah.
And what I would also say beyond that is we talked about the increase of violence, the risk of violence against women already, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've seen how there have been actual casualties as that plays out already when it comes to restrooms. Amy Toms, as an example, she donated her hair to Locks of Love in Danbury, Connecticut, and then went to a bathroom at the Walmart there. She was accosted by another woman in the restroom who accused her of being trans simply because she had a buzz cut. There's another woman who had a similar example happen to her when she was in Las Vegas, Nevada, at a casino. A group of women came up to her and told her she had to leave simply because she had short hair. Again, it encourages body policing. So that means any woman who enters a restroom who has short hair, who is taller, who is more athletic, who has a deeper voice, who might have PCOS, has her gender questioned. And oftentimes it's not just the women who are the other women in the restroom saying leave. Sometimes it's a man who comes up and then wants to get into an physical altercation with that woman who's just simply trying to relieve herself.
Sure.
And it's actually led to specific violence. Examples include the brutal death of Michelle Dion Peacock in Richmond, Indiana, who was brutally slaughtered by her neighbor because he believed that she was a Black trans woman. Or Jasmine Adams in Staten Island, who was dragged out by her hair by a deli worker because he believed that she was a Black trans woman.
Mm-hmm.
Both these women are just cis women trying to live their everyday lives.
Well,
So
sometimes
these policies-
hatred can be so blunt.
Yeah, but that's the point, though, is that
doesn't
most
matter
of these
the-
policies that categorically bar access to sex-separated spaces,
It's just one
they don't
problem
protect
creating.
anyone. They actually increase violence, and they also encourage people to panic, be more vigilant, engage in body policing, and may actually lead to more casualties.
And those are absolutely terrible stories and instances. But I think any sane person, whether they agree that it should be one way or the other, is not going to utilize the arguments over these types of issues to take that kind of action against anybody. It shouldn't be the case. Do you know what I mean? I'm good. It shouldn't be the case. Do you know what I mean? I think that has more to do with problems with those individuals that have done that to those women than it does general society. We need to talk about these
things. But what I will say is that anti-trans rhetoric has increased violence against all women.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
And that's in part because when we talk about anti-trans rhetoric, it's oftentimes the vilification of trans women specifically. And so we begin again policing the bodies of all women. Who's feminine enough to be called a woman?
Which is important to say because it just does go back to there's still issues with, even like you said, it's not just trans women or trans men, but cis women. We still live in a time to where certain categories of people are marginalized.
So moving on to the next subject, and again, this is one that I had personal experiences with within my own household. When talking about gender dysphoria, what are your thoughts and feelings from a medical perspective as to at what point should it be before a minor receives puberty blockers or hormones, surgical procedures, and whose call should that be? Age specific, all of those types of things.
Sure. So I think before we have a discussion about medical care, it's important to identify the diagnosis that we're discussing, and that is gender dysphoria, right? And so what we're talking about is the distress that exists for an individual that manifests when their sex assigned at birth is discordant with their gender identity, right? And that distress can be incredibly debilitating and limits significant major life activities, right? It may limit their ability to interact with others. It may limit their ability to sleep. It may limit their ability to concentrate, to think, to communicate, all of which become disabling in many ways, right? And so when someone lacks access to treatment, you're essentially making them incapacitated, right? When we're talking about a child who has a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, again, we're coming back to consistent,
and what are you categorizing as child? Under 18? You know what I mean?
Under 18.
Under 18.
Okay. So let's talk about a minor then.
Okay.
That might be easier, right?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about a minor who has a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, again, we're talking about the consistent, insistent, and persistent assertion of that youth's gender identity, right? And so what is supposed to happen, consistent with the World Professional Association of Transgender Health's guidelines in SOC 8, which is the leading and most current volume of WPATH standards, is after there has been a consistent, insistent, and persistent assertion of that child's gender identity, that child ordinarily would otherwise undergo talk therapy for a series of years, right? To essentially explore how persistent, consistent, and insistent that assertion is, right? And through the discussion of talk therapy, through discussions with one's parents, through one's discussions with others medical providers, because it is a multidisciplinary practice, you identify when it's appropriate to engage in other types of medical intervention, right? So that might mean social transition, where that child is otherwise able to change their name legally, is otherwise able to dress and express themselves in accordance with their affirmed gender, and participate through life in all aspects as someone of their affirmed gender, right? It can also mean medical transition, right? And there are two different components of medical transition. We've already discussed cross-sex hormone therapy or hormone therapy more broadly, which oftentimes involves puberty blockers as well. And then it can also mean surgical intervention. To be clear, before we get to any type of medical intervention outside of social transition, again, the diagnosis has to be firmly rooted. The diagnosis has to be consistent, persistent, and insistent before one is able to access that treatment. So it's not as if a child can just simply go to their to a therapist and say, I want to begin estrogen tomorrow. They're not going to get it.
in part because even accessing estrogen requires preliminarily a letter from one's therapist consistent with the WPATH standards of care, that then after having an assessment from a therapist, being able to go to a primary care provider or in some instances an endocrinologist, which is what I would recommend ordinarily, or a nurse practitioner who knows endocrinology, to be able to begin a hormone therapy, right? I don't think it's appropriate to necessarily identify a specific age. And the reason is, if that individual's distress is so severe that it may cause them to end their lives, and the solution is to provide them the care that they require medically, then why not provide them that care, right? Let's think about it in any other type of diagnosis, right? Let's say, hypothetically speaking, and I know you have a daughter. Let's say your daughter has diabetes, okay? And the state were to come in and say to you, your daughter is prohibited from having insulin to treat her diabetes until the age of 18, because we know that if administered inappropriately, it may cause your daughter to go into a coma, a diabetic coma. So therefore, we're categorically barring her from accessing medically necessary care, right? That doesn't eliminate your daughter's risk throughout the entirety of her age of minority, right? She's still at risk of otherwise having significant issues due to her diabetes until she's able to access that insulin, right? That might mean hospitalization. It may mean other disabling conditions until she's able to receive that treatment. And I'm sure you would want to make sure that your daughter has the treatment that she needs, so that she can live a fulfilling life, right? Absolutely. And be able to navigate life through like any other person would. The same is true with any other parent who wants to be able to assure that their child has access to medically necessary care. And when we're talking about gender affirming care, it is safe, it is effective, and the percentages of regret are substantially lower than any other treatment. Did you know that more people regret having knee or hip replacement surgery than they do undergoing gender affirming care? It's kind of alarming when you think about it.
Speaking of gender affirming care, do you have statistics on how many actual operations of physical change as a minor that have been done on the body in the United States by
I would be
doctors?
interested to know.
I'm genuinely interested, and I was doing some research last night, and it was very hard for me to find what I felt were actual factual. Is that because it's so rare that it happens, or is it just more that it's because of medical laws and requirements that certain things like that, because they are minors, that you don't really have a statistic on what?
So there are minors who do have access to hormone therapy. There are people under the age of 18 who have otherwise had top surgery. I know no example of a minor who has had access to bottom surgery. What I would say is, I am unfamiliar with specific percentages or empirical data that demonstrate what the actual numbers are, because again, we're talking about a very small percentage of the population. But if you're interested in finding out more information about what gender affirming care looks like and the biases that actually went into the recent study that was issued by the Department of Health and Human Services under the Trump administration, then what I would do is I would encourage you to actually look at some of the publications that we at Advocates for Trans Equality have recently issued in response to those studies. Because what those studies are actually encouraging now are conversion practices for children, which, as we've already discussed, are ineffective and actually dangerous. But what our response to those studies have demonstrated is, again, that gender affirming care is safe, it's effective, and the percentage of regret is significantly lower than all forms of other medical treatment.
And I think this one's hard for me because of my personal experience that I went through with my daughter.
Yeah.
And
well, I think for you, it's not just as black and white as your conservative supporter side thinks anymore, because you had a personal lived experience now to see a little bit of all sides.
But I can still quite confidently say that I would not have been comfortable with Nayeli undergoing any type of anything until she was 18.
Oh, absolutely. And me and you, and to be honest, because I do want to say this too, because I think it's important for somebody on my side. I have more conservative views on that. Me and you've discussed this. I've opened up to you, sis, about these things. I don't believe that any child, now granted, this is more of a lived-in experience and therefore it's an opinion. It's not a fact on this. But I personally believe that other than counseling, authentically letting them walk in their life, which I will say you did for Niley when she was experiencing Alex on that journey. But for me, I am not a fan, nor do I agree with surgeries until puberty has been met and passed. And I say that because we are also dealing with a different time with social media. Social media content, views, and I feel as though we come from a different time. We come from a time where none of those distractions were created to us. So we were able to follow a more authentic line.
So here's what I'll say.
You know what I mean?
You've identified a couple of items that I want to address. The first is the notion that rapid onset gender dysphoria exists is a myth. It's not even actually recognized by any major medical organization because it is a myth to instill panic amongst parents about their children's own authentic expression. When we talk about gender affirming care for minors, I think it is appropriate to go ahead and provide a minor access to cross-sex hormone therapy or puberty blockers before they begin endogenous puberty. And the reason is...
So can you give an age, an estimate medical standard for
that
age?
No, I can't, because people begin endogenous puberty at different ages. Indeed, the same medical treatments that are available, that are now being barred to trans children, are otherwise available to cisgender children. I don't know if you knew that.
Mm-mm.
There's something called precocious puberty, where, let's say, hypothetically speaking, an 8-year-old girl begins developing significantly earlier than she otherwise would. And that actually creates a lot of distress for her for a number of reasons.
That was me.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, doctors are now able to halt that precocious puberty
Okay.
using the same care and treatment that is otherwise available until recently, that is used for trans children who require care for their gender dysphoria. So in essence, what we're talking about specifically when we're talking about puberty blockers is eliminating the possibility that someone begins puberty at a specific age. For a child who's experiencing precocious puberty, that distress is very real, right? Much like a child who is experiencing gender dysphoria, the distress is very real because their body is beginning to develop in a way that is inconsistent with who they know themselves to be, right? And so you can pause that development by providing them access to puberty blockers. Now, puberty blockers are safe, they're reversible, and it is an appropriate form of treatment, right? And during that period, one can continue going through talk therapy until that patient, their provider, and their parents collectively decide when it's an appropriate time for that child to begin other forms of care, right? But I don't think it's appropriate for the government to come in and say, we're categorically stopping you from accessing care altogether, right? Because that care is a very personal decision.
I don't think it's the government's
Right.
place to say yes or no to anything that has
Right.
to do
And
with
I think
it.
we're all in unison because I don't.
Right.
I don't either. Yeah.
I mean, medical care is a very personal decision,
Yes,
right?
100%.
And
But I also agree that in end of life scenarios, because I went through terrible cancer with my mother, other countries allow people to leave with dignity, and I actually believe that should be an option.
Actually, me
to
too.
us,
You're
too. So
talking about
there's
assisted.
so much. Yes,
You're speaking of
so
assisted
much
suicide.
stuff
And to be clear,
that should be our
Yes.
decision.
To be
not
clear,
theirs.
Absolutely, I
To
should
be-
totally agree
yeah,
with
and
you.
to be clear, there are some jurisdictions that permit end of life care similar to what you're talking about,
Mhm.
right? Now, there are other jurisdictions that criminalize it.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that either.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
your
if-
personal choice.
I
It's
think it
all
is
of
your
your
personal
medical
choice, right? It is your own bodily autonomy. Much like I believe that if a woman needs access to abortion care, she should be able to get access to abortion care. And the reality is, oftentimes when we're talking about late stage abortion, it's not even about a woman who, unbeknownst to her, immediately discovers that she's been pregnant and now wants to end her pregnancy. It's typically because a catastrophic event has occurred later in pregnancy and it necessitates an abortion either to save the mother's life or because there are significant complications with the development of the fetus, right? And so, and I've had several friends who've unfortunately had to have late-term abortion. It is traumatizing for them because they wanted that child. But
I think
also,
that's a different
right.
scenario than someone holding off to late stage for other reasons.
Yeah, but I don't know many people who would just hold off late stage for different reasons, right? I mean, the reality is, and we've seen how this has had a horrific impact on women who require immediate care, right? Where some women have actually died because providers in states that maintain criminal prohibitions against abortion care are unable to provide these women medically necessary care and treatment because they're afraid that they're going to be prosecuted for providing these women the care that they need. So we've seen how this has a horrible impact on women who require care, abortion care, or other pregnant people who require abortion care. We're also seeing how this has a horrible impact on children and adults, by the way, because there are some jurisdictions that are seeking to prohibit adults from accessing gender-affirming care, the impact that has. Now, I can tell you anecdotally, were I able to have accessed care significant earlier in my life, I would have done it, no questions asked. Like, had I been able to access that care in my youth, I would have been significantly happier.
Well, look at the state. So, we had that scenario with my daughter, and I did not realize that that a child could take blockers that could be reversed. I was not aware of that. But in the state of Pennsylvania, they can make medical choices for themselves at 12 years old. So my daughter's going through this from 12 to 15 for 3 years. And effectively, she could have made those choices for herself. I don't agree with that. She was not in a mental state or anything.
I mean, I would say
she should have been making medical choices.
I guess I guess with you. For me, I do completely understand. I'm not a parent, but I can say that I remember being 12 years old and the decisions that I would definitely make now in my life, even in my 20s, were completely different than what my brain would have allowed me to understand and comprehend at 12 years old.
I understand, but it's also a case-by-case basis, right? And oftentimes when jurisdictions maintain policies that provide a youth bodily autonomy over their medical treatment, it's very case-specific and oftentimes involves scenarios where the child is either subject to a custodial situation where they aren't living with a parent or guardian, but may otherwise be in foster care, may otherwise be subject to the child social services system. And so in those scenarios, it may make sense for the child to have that autonomy and go ahead and be able to make medical decisions for themselves. But even assuming it's your daughter, which we've discussed, she's not making that decision independently of her own, right? She still has to have that consult with her providers and determine, based on her provider's recommendations, and also with her provider's authorization, whether to begin that care. I don't know if she ever began that care. I'm not going to make any assumptions, but I assume based on her provider, she may not have.
But being a devil's advocate, earlier in our conversation, we spoke about healthcare providers that go into scenarios with biases. So, for instance, if my daughter had gone to a doctor who had bias the other way and thought, this is valid, you are truly going, which she did truly go through it, but that you are ready and would have given her access to that care, there's nothing I would have been able to do to them. But you know what I mean?
I hear the concern. And so what I would say is the WPATH standards do delineate different provisions of care for youth than they do adults. And that's why the consistent, persistent, insistent standard applies to children much more than it does adults, right? And that's to ensure that we're dealing with a child who is indeed experiencing severe gender dysphoria. And even assuming they are experiencing gender dysphoria, but it's not severe, you try different courses of treatment, right? So I'm going to use,
we did,
right, and I'm going to use myself as an example, again, just because it's easy for me to do so, because I can talk about my own story. You know, I began with talk therapy, much like most people who are trans. And then when I was able to access medical transition, because my insurance finally covered it, I began preliminarily with testosterone blockers. And then after being on testosterone blockers for several months, I began my estrogen. And then after being on estrogen for more than a year, I was able to access surgical care. And then I did surgical care incrementally. It's not like I went in on the table and had them do everything all at once. That would have been extremely traumatizing to my body. I'm not sure anyone live undergoing that many hours of surgery. And it would be medically ill-advised to undergo that many hours of surgery. But it is something that happens incrementally. Much like there are some trans women who have top surgery, there are some trans women who don't have top surgery. There are some trans women who have bottom surgery. There are some trans women who don't have bottom surgery, right? There are some trans women who undergo hormone therapy, and there are others who don't. And it's all because it's an individualized assessment to meet that individual patient's needs to treat their gender dysphoria. So what one patient needs is not necessarily what another patient is going to need.
Sure, I can understand that. Absolutely. So with all of this said, we're kind of circling around. And this
You've answered
right
so many other
this.
questions.
And this
too.
is the purpose of this entire podcast. I'm definitely going to leave here with so many things to think and consider.
And me too.
Do I think it's going to change my mind about everything? Probably not. But certain things it definitely will, or definitely make me research more.
Sure.
And with that being said, from the conservative point of view, we often argue that questioning aspects of gender ideology is increasingly labeled as hate. I get accused or people assume that I'm going to hate them because of where I'm coming from, which I can tell you is absolutely not the case. I absolutely love everybody. If you are a good person, I'm going to love you. And I teach my children exactly the same. And that's how we've become friends. Do you personally believe that there's enough room today for open debate on these issues? And how do we even begin facilitating that being possible?
Sure. So a couple of things that I want to identify. Preliminarily, you mentioned gender ideology. Gender ideology is actually a phrase that I don't like using. And the reason I don't like using it is because it actually disregards the experience of trans people. It suggests to some degree that we're talking about a belief system.
Okay, yes.
We're not talking about a person's belief system.
Sure.
We're talking about a person's lived experience, right? And so when we're talking about gender identity, also, I think it's important to note that each of us has a gender identity, right? You have a gender identity. It happens to align with your sex assigned at birth. Your gender identity is man or male. Your sex assigned at birth is male. Your gender identity is woman/female. Your sex assigned at birth. I'm making assumptions here, but it's female, right? My gender identity is female. My sex assigned at birth is male. But each of us has those things, right? And it's about enabling individuals who have that discordance and suffer the distress because of that discordance are able to still navigate society in a way that acknowledges their human dignity. And I think oftentimes what we see happening, unfortunately, is an effort to incite fear. And that
on both sides.
On both sides, I would agree. But I would say is, as an example, during Trump's campaign in the 2024 election cycle, he spent $21 million just on anti-trans advertising before October 9th of 2024. That is an enormous amount of money to essentially create a very specific narrative around trans people, right? He presented that narrative. Unfortunately, Vice President J.D. Vance also presented a very specific narrative where he essentially alleged that middle-class white teenagers were becoming non-binary just so that they could enter elite colleges and universities. That is the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard in my life. Like, no one chooses to be subject to anti-trans rhetoric. No one chooses to be subject to oppression and increased risk of violence. No one chooses that.
And that's so true. I just quick, sorry. I just want to real quick, because I like giving scenarios to the viewers. I want to go back real quick to the conversation in the kitchen with my mom, because the second part of that conversation was when she said, well, I just don't understand why you're choosing to be in so much pain. Why you choose? I said, Mom, what? I said, I get spit on every day at school. I get beat over the head with books. I have my cosmetology kit taken and thrown all over the walks as they're kicking me in my back. Do you believe that if it was a choice that I would endure this every single day? It'd be so much easier. And I said that at one point. I said, I would prefer to be straight in the world right now. You know, so again, just going off of what you said, most humans would never choose to endure that type of pain if they had a choice.
And there's this notion that I will say, in certain white Christian national circles, that suggest that LGBTQI plus people are somehow grooming youths. Well, that is a narrative that has been used time and time again through history. It was used by Anita Bryant during the 70s against any educator who happened to be LGBTQI plus identifying, right? And it led to the dismissal or discharge of many gay and lesbian and bisexual people from education, many of whom were incredible teachers, right? We also saw it happen during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in what was called the Lavender Scare, which accompanied the Red Scare, right? I'm sure you're familiar with Senator Joe McCarthy. Mm-hmm. He essentially engaged in a series of different practices that led to more than 1,400 individuals being denied federal employment because they were suspected LGBTQI plus people. There was a discharge of more than 400 people from military service because they were suspected LGBTQI plus people. There was also the FBI and the US Postal Service at that time monitoring people's mail to see what information they were receiving because they were suspected LGBTQI plus people. That level of vigilance, that level of animus towards a group of people is unhelpful, right? And certainly it's a great waste of tax dollars when you think about it, right? There are much better things that we could be spending our tax dollars on, like ensuring that people who require care get the care that they need, right? Mm-hmm. Or ensuring that all children have access to a free and fair public education, right? We have a long way to go in those two areas, and yet we're spending an enormous amount of money. As I mentioned, $21 million before October 9, 2024 on a campaign to vilify trans people before the 2024 election, just to get votes. To me, that's reprehensible. To me, that shouldn't be happening.
I think I saw that kind of investment on both sides.
Well, I was just gonna, and I will say this, I think, sorry to interrupt you, Jen. I think with that, what you were about to say, I just interrupted too soon.
But did it involve
I think we've seen many administrations on both sides spend frivolous money on things when it came to labels and labeling that did not need to
encourage votes.
That's what I'm saying. I'm just saying on all sides. We've seen it on all sides, and I'm not defending I'm not just saying that because it happened on this side that it was okay that Trump spent that much money. Well, Trump's administration spent that much money on that, because to me, taking labeling and ideology and everything we've talked about today, there's a lot of things that us as a whole of Americans could have used that money on something completely different that would have benefited us.
And that's a whole
different topic.
I mean, I watched a great, another different podcast just very recently about how the third party is going to rise, because there are so many people like me who sit just slightly this side, and people that sit just slightly this side that are tired of it on both sides. Mm-hmm. And so it starts with those independent individuals winning their local elections, right? And then that builds a platform for those individuals to start winning at a federal level and actually create change.
A change to make actual longevity
on both sides.
Absolutely.
I truly, truly believe that. And that's a whole nother kind of scenario.
Yeah.
But this is more about how do we encourage further conversation from individuals where we can learn from each other?
Well, we're doing it now.
Yes.
I was just going to say, and sometimes it starts by showing that we can't just communicate.
We're doing it now. And I think this actually is a great way to circle back to the discussion that we had about true and accurate information available in public libraries, available in schools, right? Because we're talking about the marketplace of ideas, where people can share their beliefs, their ideas, their thoughts, engage in independent thought, not necessarily agree on everything, but at least begin to understand one another.
And this has been incredibly helpful and eye-opening.
Absolutely. And a great conversation. Do you have anything else at this
No,
point?
except for to say, when I read your resume, I was a little bit overwhelmed. I was like, I'm a little bit shy to meet this person. You're so accomplished, and it's just, absolutely. Especially hearing your story and where you kind of come from and what you've gone through and everything else. I mean, you are you're a credit to humanity, period.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And what I would say is, I feel very lucky to have had the love and support of my family throughout my life. And I realized that my experience is somewhat anomalous for most trans people, and that's because I've always had my family's love and support, right? So major applaud to any parents out there who are supporting their children as they're, struggling through adversity, whether it be because they happen to be LGBTQI+, whether they're experiencing gender dysphoria, whether they're otherwise experiencing bullying in school. If you're there for your child, it makes a world of difference. And so what I would say is listen to your children, make sure that they feel loved and supported, make sure that they always feel safe, because that's what made the difference for me. There were many a time that I felt like I wanted to abandon my passions or my dreams. My parents never let me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just have, before Jen closes up for us, I have one more question, because this is an important feat for you, and something that me and you have so much common in. As your bio stated, you have done female impersonation, which is, to many viewers, that's also drag. We have a huge pageantry system, and you recently won Miss Gay America Femme.
Yes.
Which I do believe is a newer part of the system, which is an even bigger honor, because you are one of their newer national title holders to hold that. With your title this year, what is something, with everything going on and all the topics we talked about today, coming from that platform, and I know you said a little bit, but what would you tell the viewers on all sides? That how do we move forward in a concept where we can look past those personal opinions and just lead with that love?
Well, what I would say is look to the way that Miss Gay America Femme operates, right? Miss Gay America Femme is essentially a division of the Gay America system that permits cis women and trans women to compete together.
Oh, really?
In harmony.
I didn't know.
Yeah. So many of the competitors with whom I competed are cis women. Many of them are trans women. Some of them are non-binary trans femme individuals who are either assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. But it's open to everyone. And we competed together. We all celebrated one another. We also shared private spaces together. I was sharing dressing rooms with cis women. No one thought any different, because I'm a woman just like anybody else.
Yeah.
But the reality is, we're able to have that commonality to live harmoniously and to all feel fulfilled, celebrated, and empowered. And I want that for everyone.
I love that. And what I love about the creating that space, though, is, and we talked about this, is that, for the longest time, going back to me, when I won Miss Teen Pittsburgh at 18 years old, and we did these prides, we did these marches, and we did these, things to say, we just want you to love us and accept us. But I think part of the responsibility in that was creating a space for this side to then come over here and say, we're not only asking you to accept us, but we're saying you deserve to be here too, if you choose to be here. And I think that's important, because part of being a leader is also opening the door for other people to not just feel that, hey, I need you to accept me, but no, I want you to come over here and know that you're accepted here too. And I think that Miss Gay America Femme being that is more than just a staple of that pageant. It's a way to say, hey, look, we're just humans trying to compete and make beautiful magic on stage.
Yeah, and for me, it's not about calling people out, it's about calling people in.
I love that.
I want people to understand my perspective, and I want to be able to understand theirs as well, so that we can find that commonality.
I agree.
Well, before Jen closes, I'm going to tell you how much I love you.
I love you too.
As viewers may not know, but Anya is not just a friend, but what we call chosen family and a sister in the gay community with me. And I just want to tell you how proud I am of you. I have gone that journey with pageants, and we've stoned and talked and cried and laughed about so many things, because at the end of the day, pageantry is family, and it's a space that we work very hard in the industry, and it's no different than Miss America in many ways, or Miss Universe in many ways. There are steps and prelims, and a lot of money, time, and heart is spent in it. And it was a great win for you. And I just want to tell you how proud I am of you and how much I love you for that. And thank you for doing this for us.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Take it away and finish that up, Jen.
So we just want to thank you for joining us. This has been Both Sides of the Fence. Thank you, Anya, again for joining us. Derek and Jen, and we'll see you next time.
Bye,
we
everyone.
love you guys.